Hello, guys. Welcome. I hope you're all doing well. Today, I'm going to be discussing the theology of St. Gregory Palamas and Thomas Aquinas and seeing who is more accurate according to the early church, whose theology fits more and is more coherent with the early church. Palamas and Aquinas both use St. Dionysius the Replicae as a heavily influential father for their works. So I want to interpret them in light of St. Dionysius the Replicae, just to be fair to both. And I'm also going to interpret St. Dionysius the Replicae in light of St. Maximus the Confessor, who's actually written extensive works on St. Dionysius the Replicae. It is ambiguous. The question we're going to be asking today is, was Aquinas right about created energies, or was Palamas right about uncreated energies? What is most likely to have been taught by Dionysius? I'm going to start off by showing St. Gregory Palamas' position. St. Gregory Palamas believes that the saints are uncreated by grace while having a created substance. He also believes God's eternal operations come down to us, not being changed by creation, but rather changing creation itself, and without any created intermediary. And St. Gregory Palamas believes in a doctrine called the essence and energy distinction, where God's operations come down to us while his essence remains incommunicable. This is Thomas Aquinas' theology. So Thomas Aquinas believes that grace is a created accident that adheres in the soul, not as having its own substance, but as an accidental form in the soul, which subsists in the soul as a predicate. And he also believes God communicates with creation merely through created effects, since God has no real relation to creatures. So now, looking at your quotes side by side, just to get a better grasp of what they believe, Palamas says in the Triads, he says, according to the Fathers, deification is an essential energy of God, but any essence of which the essential energies are created must itself necessarily be created. Barlam, indeed, does not blush to claim that all the powers and natural energies of God are created, even though our faith teaches us that every saint is a temple of God by reason of the grace that indwells him. How could the dwelling place of a creature be a temple of God? How could every saint become uncreated by grace if the grace is created? Obviously, Palamas is making the argument against Barlam that how do the saints become uncreated by grace, like the saints say, if the grace that's given to us is created? That's basically his argument. So he believes that we're able to partake of God's uncreated divine energies without partaking in God's essence and becoming uncreated by virtue of that. And an analogy I would like to give as well that St. Maximus the Confessor actually uses is that if you were to put like an iron in a fire, an iron would assume the properties of the fire, such as illuminating and burning. It would be able to emit radiance and also burn. So these things are not proper to the iron itself, but because of what it participates in, it assumes these predicates. The same way, us who participate in the light of God, we also assume God's own divine energies, and thus become like him. Thomas Aquinas' position is as follows. As Boethius says, the being of an accident is to inhere. Hence no accident is called being as if it had being, but because by it something is, hence it is said to belong to a being rather than to be a being. And because to become and to be corrupted belong to what is, properly speaking, no accident comes into being or is corrupted, but is said to come into being and to be corrupted inasmuch as its subject begins or ceases to be in act with this accident. And thus grace is said to be created, inasmuch as men are created with references to it, given a new being out of nothing, i.e., not from merits, according to Ephesians 2, verse 10, created in Jesus Christ in good works. So we're seeing a clear contradiction between Palamas' theology and Aquinas' theology. Palamas believes that grace is uncreated and actually allows others to become uncreated, not by substance but by grace. And Aquinas believed that grace is something created and that subsists in us as a predicate. So let's see what St. Maximus the Confessor has to say about this. He says, therefore the great Melchizedek is said to be without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, just as our God-bearing fathers have truly said that it is not on account of his human nature, which was created out of nothing, and by virtue of which he had both a beginning and an end, but on account of the divine and uncreated grace, which exists eternally and is beyond all nature and time. For it is the grace of the eternal God, and it was solely by this that he was begotten wholly and willingly, and solely from this that he can now be known. So Maximus Confessor clearly coincides with St. Gregory Palamas' theology. However, the theology of Thomas Aquinas of the created grace that adheres in the soul as a predicate is something unheard of by St. Maximus Confessor. Maximus Confessor actually says that the reason why Melchizedek is said to be eternal is because he's partaking of an eternal uncreated energy. So this uncreated energy that Melchizedek is partaking of is something that flows forth from God's essence because it's uncreated. And it's not the essence, because obviously Melchizedek isn't partaking of the essence. And I want to pinpoint something that's very important here with St. Maximus, when he says that we become uncreated by virtue of grace and not by virtue of our substance. We do not change our substance. Our substance stays the same. We're still human. We're not God by nature, rather God by grace. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind. And this is just a necessary conclusion from what I've got from St. Maximus Confessor's quote. He says, grace is uncreated. Grace is truly participated in, not merely conceptually or extrinsically. What God is by nature is by grace communicated to the saints. The saints, without undergoing any substantial change, assume divine qualities as predicates. The conclusion would therefore be, the saints are uncreated by grace, since they truly participate in the uncreated grace that is without beginning or end. Which, if we're being honest to the text, shows that Thomas Aquinas' position is false. And now, moving on to the essence-energy distinction. So starting off with St. Palamas, in his 150 chapters, section 100, he says, quote, if the energies of God are not in any sense distinct from the divine substance, neither will they have any distinction with respect to one another. Therefore, God's will is not at all distinct from his foreknowledge, with the result that either God will not know all things beforehand, for he does not will everything that happens, or he wills also evil things, because he has foreknowledge of all things, and either he has not had foreknowledge of all things, which is the same as saying he is not God, or he is not good, which is the same as saying he is not God. Therefore, the divine foreknowledge is distinct from the will, and thus each of these is distinct from the divine substance. So he's clearly differentiating not only between the energies and the essence, but also between the energies themselves. He makes an argument for why will and foreknowledge can't be the exact same, because if God knows all things, and if willing is identical to foreknowledge, right, then that would mean that God, having knowledge of evil, also wills evil. That's why he finds it necessary to differentiate between will and foreknowledge in reality. However, Aquinas has a different take in this. He says, quote, in God, to be is the same as to be wise, but to be wise is the same thing as to understand. Therefore, in God, to be is the same thing as to understand. But God's existence is his substance, as shown above. Therefore, the act of God's intellect is his substance. Reply to objection 1. To understand is not an operation proceeding out of the operator, but remaining in him. End quote. So with Aquinas, the distinction between the essence and the energies does not exist actually in reality, since he says the operations remain in him without flowing forth from him. This obviously is in complete contradiction with what Palamas says, and also with what St. Maximus the Confessor says. So when Aquinas says God's operations remain in him, he's implying that operations are identical to essence. However, with St. Maximus, this is clearly not the case, because it's communicated to creatures. And if it's communicated to creatures, it can't be the essence, because if God's essence is being communicated to creatures, that would just mean that creatures have become consubstantial with God, which is obviously not the case. Now, moving on to the St. Dionysius the Areopagus analogy of the sun, he says, quote, for even as our sun, not as calculating or choosing, but by its very being enlightens all things able to partake of the light in their own degree, so too the good as superior to a sun, as the archetype par excellence, is above an obscure image, by its very existence sends to all things that be the rays of its whole goodness, according to their capacity. By reason of these rays, subsisted all the intelligible and intelligent essences, and powers, and energies. So a few things to take from this. He says the very being of the sun illuminates all things, able to partake of it. So the very being, the essence, illuminates all things able to partake of it. Then he also says the sun, not as calculating or choosing, so its natural energy, its natural emanation, radiates the goodness of its very being to those able to partake of it. So it's God's own very natural energy. It's not some sort of created thing that's a product of some sort of precedent will. No, it's actually truly uncreated, and it's God's own natural energy, and it flows forth from him to creatures. If you follow what St. Dionysius says, St. Dionysius likens the energies to the rays and likens the essence to the core, if you will, of the sun. If we take Thomas Aquinas' theology into this and say that this energy, let's say it's an effect or a create effect, this would mean then God is created, because like St. Maximus the Confessor says, anything that has a create energy or anything that doesn't have an energy doesn't exist. If it doesn't have an energy, it doesn't exist, right? Therefore, if God gained this energy, he would come into being and he wouldn't really be God. And if you interpret it in light of, for example, when he says that the energy remains in him, that's clearly not what St. Dionysius says. He says that it emanates forth from him as like the sun, as like the rays emanate forth from the sun. That's clearly not what he's saying. So really and truly, it's impossible to interpret this quote from St. Dionysius in light of Thomas Aquinas. So now moving on to critique one. I've already kind of said the first objection in critique one, but I'm going to just say it again. The radiance of the sun is meant by Dionysius to be God's creative effects. Rebuttal to critique one. According to St. Maximus, anything without energy is non-existent. Therefore, to say that God was once without this energy would mean that there was a time when God did not exist. Critique 2. Dionysius was referring to the energies that don't inhere in God, not the operations identical to his essence. Rebuttal to critique 2. St. Dionysius refers to the radiance of the sun as not brought forth by calculation or choice, very important, but as from the very substance. The things that come forth from God's precedent will are created, while that which comes forth from his substance is natural to his very being. This is the same thing I said before earlier. If these energies emanate forth from God's own substance, you can't say they're created. To say they're created is to say God is created, right? And we're going to see later on from St. Maximus the Confessor's quote that to say anything that emanates forth from God's essence naturally is created is to say God is created. And to say that something that naturally emanates forth from God's essence is his essence is also just as crazy. Because how can something participate in God's essence without becoming God by nature? So moving on to critique 3. The fullness of the essence isn't given to creatures, but only a taster of what is to come in the beatific vision. Rebuttal to critique 3. The rays of its whole goodness is said to be given to creatures, so the fullness of God is said to be distributed to creation. So he says the fullness of God. He doesn't say some part or some sort of vision. He says the whole of God is communicated to creatures, right? And this also is the same as St. Gregory Palamas' theology, right? Because St. Gregory Palamas says that God is wholly and entirely in each energy without being divided or being contained, but containing all within himself. So let's move on to another point we can take from the analogy. So all things that exist, the intelligible and intelligible essences, powers, and energies, right? Energies, focus on that, are held together by this super essential ray. The super essential ray exists. Conclusion. The super essential ray holds itself together and is the grounding and sustenance of its own existence. So the reason why I came to this conclusion is because St. Dionysius the Areopagite says all existence, all things that be, everything that exists is held together by this ray. So the whole created order, right, is held together by this ray, sustained by this ray. If the ray is also within the created order, you'd be making the ray a necessary being, right, that always exists because it in itself is the reason why it exists. The reason what sustains it is its own existence, which makes it self-existent and necessary. The ray can't be identical to God's essence because if it was identical to God's essence, it would be communicating God's essence to creatures. But it also has to inhere in something. Because if it doesn't inhere in something, it's necessary in of itself, which means you have two gods. The only way to get out of this apparent contradiction is to hold to what St. Gregory Palamas believes, which is that although the energies inhere in the essence, they still flow forth from it and are participated in by creatures. So moving on to the next possible objection. St. Dionysius isn't implying all things that exist are sustained by the superessential ray, but simply that they sustain all intelligible creatures. Rebuttal. St. Dionysius says that the superessential ray sustains all energies also, and if this is interpreted in light of St. Maximus the Confessor, anything that doesn't have its own natural energy is non-existent, since no beings remain what they are when they're deprived of their natural constituent elements. So that sums up the whole video here. Thank you guys for watching. If you have any comments, if you want to say anything, if you want to ask a question, you can just put in the comment section below. Yeah, let me know who you think was more accurate, a Palamas or Aquinas. Thank you guys for watching, and glory be to the Father, to the Son, to the Holy Spirit.